All right. Well, it looks like we are at 10:15 here, so let's go ahead and get started. So at this point, this is the open discussion part of our meeting. So I'd like to hand it off to different members of the ad hoc group. Anyone that has any comments or thoughts here to get our discussion going. See, Rune, I believe you had a set of questions that you were wanting to read for the group there. That might be a good place to start.
Great, I am happy to do so. Welcome back from the break and happy Friday to everybody. Let's see, I had a total of 7 questions and then 2 notes. So I'll just go sequentially through and start with 1 and end up at 7. So the first question.
Oh, Rune, and as you go, why don't you, as you read each question, I think we have some thoughts on a response for them. So maybe as you read them, we'll go ahead and respond as we go. So just for everyone else, that might be easier for them to follow than. So let's try that.
Sounds great. I will pause and give the department a chance to respond. All right. So for question number 1, please identify the licensed civil engineer designated to supervise the Oroville Dam. And this is with respects to Water Code section 6025.6, where it says the dam owner shall employ a civil engineer who is registered in the state to supervise the structure for the protection of life and property for the full operating life of the structure.
Yeah, so for that one, Ted, do you want to start with your perspective on that?
Yeah, John, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Rune. And so I'll start, and then I think David Sarkissian will join in as well. So overall, for the State Water Project, my position serves in a capacity in different ways, but as one role would be as chief engineer, overall for the State Water Project. And so I'm a licensed civil engineer, and then specifically for our dam facilities, we've identified David Sarkissian as our chief dam safety engineer. And so he's the civil engineer with responsibility, delegated responsibility for the Oroville Dam facilities.
This is Dave. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I would just add that, so yeah, I manage our State Water Project Dam Safety Program. I've got a staff of about 25 right now. And so my staff is really engaged in the surveillance and monitoring of the dam and the annual inspections. And so on an annual basis, they're writing reports with all the instrumentation data, the inspection results, and rolling that up into an annual report that we submit to FERC and DSOD, and provide our conclusions in terms of the safe continued operation of the dam. Of course, we rely on other parts of the department in terms of analyses and design and construction projects, as well as consultants. And we have the benefit of also relying on unique efforts like this, relying on the findings of our Part 12 boards and Director of Safety Review boards on non-FERC licensed dams. And so I feel like I'm in a great position to be getting all sorts of feedback and information, that differing opinions, and using that to make decisions on where we invest, what do we study, and as I mentioned before, trying to identify the top risks and go after those.
All right. Well, thank you both. And so, Rune, I think that's our thought and our response to your first question. So,
okay. So, So just to clarify, is it Ted? Is it Dave? Or is it both?
Yeah. So Dave, this is Ted Rune. So Dave is delegated the responsibility to be our chief dam safety engineer. So he's specifically delegated that responsibility for our State Water Project dams, including Oroville Dam. I think I just wanted to give a little context on, how we're organized, and that, and Dave added a little more in terms of, the wide range of support he has from registered civil engineers as well.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to move on to question number 2. Question number 2 is a little long-winded, so hopefully we can attach my written version of the questions along with the verbal one here, but away we go. So question number 2. DWR has the option to utilize any number of methods for purposes of internal risk-based decision-making, i.e. these risk-based methods that you've been discussing this morning. These methods, however, have not been approved by other stakeholders, such as the community of Oroville. Ultimately, the community is promised a level of performance from this structure as defined in the plans, specifications, operation plans, etc. Let's call these the normal conditions. The risk-based approaches list consequences, but these consequences do not fully account for impacts to the community should the infrastructure fail to meet these normal operations while subject to the design or anticipated loading conditions. As a result, this consequence analysis is incomplete and requires updating to quantify the community remedy associated with failed normal operations during design or the anticipated loading conditions.
All right, so for that one, I think we were going to turn to Les to give our thoughts on a response to your question there, Brent.
Sure, John. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
So it is a long question, and I'm not sure if some of the part of the question is beyond the scope of the CNA, but let me give you an initial thought or two. The CNA is basically a dam safety and operational reliability and needs assessment. And to do this, we used the risk analyses that have been established in practice by the federal government, by both the Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation for over 3 decades. And we've used processes that are recommended in the guidance documents by FERC as well. We've used the same thing that the level 2 analysis basically has done. Now, those traditional risk analyses and those outlined in FERC are principally oriented toward life loss as a consequence. The FERC documents do talk about financial impacts, but there's no criteria for them. So there's no, for instance, the tolerable risk reference line that we've talked about only pertains to life loss. It doesn't pertain to financial impacts or any other consequences. So there's no guidance on that. We did want to incorporate other things besides life loss. We wanted to go beyond what is generally used for dam safety assessments. And so we have included financial impacts, and those include not only direct impacts to the State Water Project, but indirect impacts, including downstream consequences. And we also looked at regulatory compliance, water supply delivery reliability, and also other State Water Project purposes such as flood control and power and environmental preservation. The guidance for those kinds of things, we were fortunate is that DWR had already developed in its asset management system criteria for that. And that was perfect for us because 1, it was already established, 2, it's already adopted by DWR, and 3, it allows us to compare the risks at Oroville to other facilities in the State Water Project, which is to a large extent why we do risk analyses, is to manage the risk across our portfolio of facilities. That's certainly the reason why, or at least one of the reasons why the Corps and Reclamation have done so. We presented that as an option for the IRB early in the project, and the IRB concurred that that was an appropriate way to go for this particular project, because this particular project is oriented mainly around dam safety needs and operational reliability. So that's the path we've chosen, and everybody has agreed to it along the way.
Thank you, Les. Okay, I'm going to move on to question number 3 for Rune, which is, did your review activities, and we're talking about the 2017 to 2020 phase, this CNA process you're undergoing, identify any areas where the current state of the infrastructure deviates from the prescribed integrity documented in the design documentation and their associated assumptions?
So this is Dave Sarkisian. You know, through the CNA process, the engineers participating there spent a lot of time looking at original design documents, visiting the facilities. And so deviations from original design, I'd say nothing significant was identified. And I think it's fair to say the L2RA team did a similar look. What did change, and this is, you know, I think for not just for this dam, it's for California, you know, dams throughout California, as well as bridges and buildings, is that, you know, the loadings change over time. The seismic loading changes, the hydraulic loadings change with, you know, better understanding of whether it's, you know, the faulting, new faults or different ways to understand ground motions. And then on the, you know, the precip side, the atmospheric rivers and climate change. And so that's the area that the most change has been seen. And so hopefully that addresses the question.
Hey, Dave, this is Les. Can I add to what you just said?
Sure.
Arun, during design, in terms of performance, they anticipated certain performance of the structures, like the embankment, for instance. They anticipated it might settle this much, or it might seep water this much, or there might be pore pressures below the FCO of this much. And so there were some anticipated levels of performance that were predicted during design. And all of those are actually are a lot less than what they anticipated. So they provided, for instance, up to 5 feet of extra fill on the dam for future settlement. It hasn't settled 5 feet. It hasn't even settled 1 foot. It's settled 10 inches. And seepage is a lot less than what they had planned for. And the pore pressures below the FCO, when we had the instrumentation going, are less than what was provided for in the design. So, as Dave said, we do have, you know, our criteria and technologies have changed over time. And so what that requires us to do is periodically update our evaluations on flat routing or seismic stability. So the facilities were reevaluated for new earthquake loadings in the 70s, about 20 years after the original design. And some of those are now being updated again for seismic loading, like the FCO. We heard about that. And one of the early implementation projects for the main dam is to reevaluate that again with the current earthquake loading using current state-of-the-art technology. Some of the criteria has changed that Oroville doesn't meet, like the drawdown criteria that was put in, that was developed long after all the large dams in California were built. And so hardly any large dam meets that fully, any existing dam. But that's part of the value of the risk analysis is to see is where, if you're not meeting the current criteria, and is that a big deal or not? Is that a significant risk? And we're not finding significant risks here at Oroville. So does that answer at least part of your question on that?
It does. Thank you. I'm going to move on to question number 4. A risk plot is presented with a number of probable failure modes, or PFMs. As of today, is that portfolio of failure modes in a state where the Oroville Dam system meets the intended level of performance and sufficient, and this is in air quotes, and I'm sensitive to Bruce's comment about factors of safety, but does it provide the intended level of performance and sufficient factor of safety against the failure of anticipated or normal operations? For example, are we compliant with all the original design intents? And are the things that you're talking about, these enhancements, really betterments, or are they trying to get us compliant with kind of the original design intent. And I think you've answered this before, but I'll put this back to the department.
So this is Dave, and I think the short answer is yes. And yeah, I guess, you know, just the conversation just a moment ago touched upon some of this. It's an area that I think the, you know, standards have evolved over time. Our understanding of the extreme loading has changed over time, and downstream consequences and the needs of stakeholders have changed over time. And so those are the areas I think that are really the areas that have been revisited and the future.
Great, thank you. Moving on to the next question. What is the factor of safety of the Oroville Dam system today? And what is the future anticipated factor of safety with the implementation of the proposed improvement projects? And again, I'm sensitive to Bruce's comment. My understanding, though, is when this dam was constructed or designed back in the 1960s, the factor of safety concept was really employed for design as opposed to risk-informed design.
Yeah, and as you know, we kind of look at a dam at each component and analyze each component and you know, drive a factor of safety, whether, you know, through the design process or potentially through an evaluation process. So we don't apply a single factor of safety to the dam system. I think what CNA has done in terms of looking at it in terms of risk gives you I think the picture maybe you're referring to. And so maybe, I don't know if Les, you want to elaborate on that or?
Yeah, sure. And so the industry at least is transitioning from traditional factor of safety points of view with are deterministic to more risk-based. And so right now we sort of do both of them. There are traditional factors of safety calculations, and there's literally hundreds of those calculations for the facilities for different structural loadings, different sliding factors of safety, different seepage and uplift factors. So there's hundreds of different factors of safety that have been calculated across the facilities in the Oroville complex. So there's not just one factor of safety. And each calculation of factor of safety can be done for normal loading and seismic loading, hydrologic loadings, and they all have different acceptable values. That's the traditional way of doing things. And then you update those over time with your better understanding of the facility or how it's aged and its structural capacity and the loadings on the other side that we already talked about. But then trying to understand the results of those factor of safety calculations is the risk analysis, which allows you to understand it could be that you have a very high factor of safety, but your risk is still high just because the consequences can be so great and uncertainty can be so great. On the other hand, the factor of safety could be low, but it's no big deal because the consequences are not significant it's not a very likely loading case. So right now we use, we're transitioning from one to the other, but we are using both right now.
Great, thanks. But just to clarify, for this question, I was looking at the overall dam system, not the individual components. So I guess the question, perhaps rephrased, is have you done a system-based either risk delineation or equivalent factor of safety that lets you know as a system, aggregating all the individual components into the larger whole, where do you stand?
Hi guys, this is Steve Varigan. Maybe a way we could answer that, Rune, is that when you saw the initial language that we had presented at IRB meeting number 2, we said that no dam safety deficiencies were identified. And so that would have been the team's evaluation, not FERC and DSOD's evaluation of that, but the team's evaluation of where we stood with respect to dam safety deficiencies. And that's connected to the older traditional factor of safety type computations. So we didn't find any factors of safety that were deficient. There are still those pending on the FCO analysis and the evaluation of the monolith 31 contact, and we're not quite finished with the PMF update approvals from FERC and DSOD. But other than that, there weren't any factor of safety deficiencies identified, but as Les indicated, there are many factors of safety, so there's not an amalgamated overall project factor of safety calculation. But what Les did say is the IRB, and we're comfortable with, has pushed us to the point that you've gone beyond the factor of safety evaluations. You've done a risk-informed and a risk-based evaluation of the dam. So where do you stand with that? And then it gets more detailed, but sometimes more obscure, because you're now talking about tolerable levels of risk. And so our answer to that question with the overall factor of safety was, you saw that there were a couple of failure modes straddling the tolerable risk line, and we're looking at reducing some of those. So that's kind of where it stands with those two perspectives.
Great, thank you. Moving on, my question number 6. So from a life cycle standpoint, where is the design life of the dam and its appurtenances explicitly documented?
So this is Dave again. You know, in some, again, it depends on the component. We look back at the original design documents, and some state a design life for that component, and others don't. And so we got to look at it from a, I think, component by component basis. You know, an example is in the plant, a piece of rotating equipment is going to have a shorter life than an earthen, embankment dam. And so the other piece there is with our growing asset management program, looking at the design life or remaining life of an asset through our current understanding of its condition and current expectations. It's a growing area for us and many other owners in looking at our assets from that perspective. And so I think I would just leave you with, if I had to point to documentation, it'd be a series of a variety of documents based on the component.
Okay, so just to clarify, are all of the components, you have a design life for them, or you have it for some but not all?
Some but not all, and so it is an area that we're growing and look forward to defining those kind of parameters.
Great, thank you. Number 7, what modifications, if any, have been identified as being required to the design loading of the Oroville Dam system in the future as a result of climate change? Have changes in loading conditions been incorporated into the current risk analysis, looking off into the future? So 2050, 2075, 2100.
So I'll scratch the surface of this, and I know Les and Steve and maybe Sergio that have more in-depth knowledge of the CNA's approach. In the risk analyses, both L2RA, Level 2, and CNA, a lot of the questions on climate change and the unknowns in terms of hydrology was addressed through just consideration of uncertainty in risk estimates, and so that led to a lot of discussions and to some areas, to some risk estimates spanning multiple boxes, so to speak. But then for portrayal purposes, the authors end up putting a failure mode in a single box. And so from like the workshop perspective and the baseline risk, a lot of it was addressed through just talking through uncertainty. But there's probably a lot more that others could speak to specific to CNA.
David, this is Steve Verrigan again, and I'll try to elaborate a little bit more with what we've done on the project. So, Ruin, we haven't gotten into detailed climate change impacts and evaluations in the CNA project with with the state of the work that we're at right now. We do have very definite plans for how that's going to be incorporated, and that's committed to in the draft reports as they stand today. But what the operations team has done is it's got very many of that the operations task team was led entirely by the DWR operations group, and they're working very hard on what they're calling FIRO, Forecasted Informed Reservoir Operations. They've got a very large group that extends beyond DWR, includes the Corps of Engineers, Yuba Water Agency, Yuba County Water Agency, and then some. There's actually a group from Scripps and some universities who are participating, and this is looking at the system impacts of reoperation of Oroville. So the operations task team for the CNA ran some scenarios with different reservoir flood pool restrictions, and I believe they looked at some climate change impacts in those. If not, they will be looked at as FIRO goes forward. The other set of variables is when you look through the alternative plans, you're going to see that there are 7 plans with the potential for adding new low-level outlet capacity at different invert elevations. And then there are 5 of those that look at implementation of a new type spillway in the footprint of the existing emergency spillway. And some of those options would be a new gated spillway at a lower invert elevation, possibly than the FCO. And the need for that is going to hinge on what this structural analysis of the existing FCO turns out. So the decisions are going to have to be made based on the existing conditions evaluations, then the future needs on the desires of the future operations, and when that comes further along in a coordinated way with those other participants I described, then the climate change hydrographs will definitely be run through those different combinations of features to evaluate the adequacy of the recommendations.
Okay, great. Sounds like that's a work in progress. That takes me to the end of my questions, and then I just had 2 comments that I wanted to read into the record. The first one was, and I think we've asked for this before, but please provide documentation establishing the PFMA as a valid and reliable method. And as part of that, I understand that these people do it and those people do it and everyone's doing it, so we should do it too. But I'm looking for data on skew between the predicted and the actual. And again, establishing this as a valid and reliable method. Secondly, please provide documentation detailing the enhancements to the PFMA method implemented following the Oroville Dam spillway incident in February 2017. As you'll note, the IFT identified a number of, we'll call them suggested improvements to the process. And the question here tries to get at what sort of enhancements or what aspects of those suggestions were incorporated into this new version as opposed to the old version of a risk-based process.
Well, thank you, Arun. The first comment you had there about the documentation establishing the PFMA. One document, just the site right here, is the FEMA, P1025 federal guidelines for dam safety risk management is an example of one document there. Just to give a quick response there, which we can see if we have anything else that would be helpful to provide for this group after this meeting. And then also with the enhancements to the PFMA method, we'll have to go back and look. I believe we had some. There was a question that came from the ad hoc group at an earlier meeting, talking about kind of what got taken from the IFT recommendations into this process. And so I think that'd be a good. We'll have to go back and look at that document and see to what extent we captured some of what you're hitting on back at that point, and see if there's anything that we think would make sense to elaborate on as far as how what we're doing now, why that's different than how PFMAs were done back prior to 2017. But hey, thank you for that list of questions, and particularly for sending them ahead of time, so to give us a minute to think about how to a way to respond to you there. Are there other questions from other folks from the ad hoc group?
I have, this is Matt again. I got some questions, but I want to make sure that everybody else has a chance to chime in with the final minutes we have.
Okay. Liz, did we have anything come through the chat?
We don't have any chat questions.
Okay. Well, Matt, the floor might be yours here then, and I guess if anybody else has a question, just chime in. But since we are down to just a few minutes left, let's let Matt ask his questions.
Yeah, John, I really enjoyed the sidebar meetings that we had, during the physical meetings, and little one-on-one discussions. And following our last physical meeting, you asked me the question on what would make the CNA process a success to me, and I emailed you about 25 bullet points. And some of those are actually questions that I think you guys did a good job of executing on how we prepared for this next meeting and meetings going forward. Some of them are left unanswered, and I think it kind of gives you my frame of mind on the evaluation and then the financing and of the alternative measures. I don't think that enough time was spent looking at the other criteria besides regulatory, water delivery, and safety. There was also other project benefits and things like that I think a lot of the constituents downstream would be interested in. So if we took like the Ford report on downstream consequences and looked, I don't know how detailed it was, I've yet to obtain it, on the benefits that different things would be prevented or provide. If we looked at the comments that were made during the relicensing process back in 2005 by the different NGOs and the asset they had, and make sure that we just run through some of those things in the evaluation of other project benefits. And if we could dialogue those as maybe another column or so within the public version of the final CNA report. The financial questions I have, I think I'll submit in a formal form following this meeting. So with a couple minutes left here, just in case something happens and we don't have a chance to meet again, I want to kind of read this closing argument to the group where, first of all, I want to thank the three co-chairs for the opportunity to serve as an ad hoc member, and hopefully I'll be able to continue, or I was able to contribute both as an informed and concerning community perspective to build trust in this process. I'd like to thank DWR as an organization for their humbled approach to this thorough process. They took input from a lot of people outside the organization, which means that they had to reveal a lot. And their determination to complete these past FERC recommendations. Hello?
Yep.
Okay. And I'm really sensing a determination to complete these not only past FERC recommendations and regulatory shortcomings, longstanding uncertainties surrounding the facility, but the courage again to open their door to transparency of the process and not allowing the public in. And I want to thank those who sat in the meeting rooms, those outside consultants who contribute a lifetime of knowledge, critical thinking to the young and upcoming ranks of the DWR engineers. You know, you got a next generation coming through, and they had a chance to play ball with the big leagues, and hopefully it serves them well through their career with you. To the IRB members who came from different corners of the industry, you know, thank you for that fresh outside perspective to the analysis, the communicational methodology, your respectful input, broke down, you know, some of those boxes and silos that kind of restricted DWR's organization. I want to thank the senior engineers and the managers in the room. You know, the work that was done over the last 3 years was historic, and what is expected over the next 5 years is equally challenging. You know, this is your time, and this will be your story to tell, you know, to the grandkids. That I don't blame you for the spillway incident or the 2 major floods into our community that I lived through. I blame the upper guidance of the organization. You know, that's kind of rooted in power and politics, that kind of lost their moral compass and their emphasis, and forgot that downstream citizens are people too. And unlike so-called water barons down south, we're just trying to make a simple living on the land we love, but saddled with a history of flood damage, declining property value, flood insurance, building restrictions, dwindling fisheries, unnavigable rivers, and the struggling communities that were promised the influx of recreational money. To the senior management, this is your time, and it's your story. This process is not just about risk metrics and blueprints. That's not what builds dams and spillways. It's people. It's humble determination, critical thinking, lifelong expertise, fresh perspectives, breaking down boxes and silos. It's following a moral compass and the belief that all people are equal, regardless of their organizational influence. Please take the time to read the IFT report on human and organizational behavior, not to beat yourself up, but to help guide you to a new and proud organization for everybody's future.
Well, Matt, I just want to thank you for those words there, and I want to say that I really appreciate all of the members of the ad hoc group, but really I do want to acknowledge you really did jump into this process, and there was a lot of material that we threw at you, and it's a topic that not a lot of folks really spend time with, and so I think it's to your credit that you jumped in and made the investment to understand the material so you could walk this road with us here. I think we gained a lot from hearing your perspective as someone downstream of the facility. Hope that likewise you're able to gain some of our perspective of how we look at the facilities. But I just want to thank you for your participation here.
Yeah, my pleasure. And look forward to the next meeting.
Yeah, likewise for those comments, and I'll just reiterate our commitment to the safety of the facilities and continuing to work together in an open and transparent way on this. So appreciate you, and as John said, all the ad hoc members and the entire team that's worked on this effort.
So as we get to our last few minutes here, I had a couple of closing thoughts here, and some of that borrows from what Matt had just mentioned of this effort really been focused around the CNA, obviously this dam safety assessment, as we talked about earlier, do do see there being one more meeting of the ad hoc group. We still need to get scheduled the next IRB meeting. We're looking sometime in August, so it would be this group. We would be looking sometime after that to get this group back together again. But as this particular group does wind down, really looking for there to be a nice transition over to the Citizens Advisory Commission. And so we do have a date on the calendar for the commission, which I need to pull up here. I believe was August 21st is the date at 10 o'clock. It likewise will be a virtual meeting here. Is how we're planning that. Just with the uncertainty around whether or not we'll all be able to get together. But encourage this group to look to that forum to participate as moving forward. And also that group has the nice benefit of being a little broader in scope than just the CNA. So I believe there's been discussions, Matt had talked about some of the financing or how that works, what that relationship between the water contractors and DWR is. And so that's been a topic that has been identified for that group to take on, is having the water contractors come in and give their perspective on how they partner with DWR and just how projects like this, how they're funded and how that ends up being funded by ratepayers throughout the state, is a good topic that we haven't touched on here in the CNA, just as we're trying to keep the scope focused. But we do have this other group that'll it doesn't have a sunset date, so we see that being a place that we can continue those discussions, as well as tracking all of the work that we're identifying here, so that folks can keep tabs on what the status is and where that work is. So that's kind of the last thoughts I had here for today for this group. So I don't know if Rob or Curtis, any closing thoughts from behalf of the Assemblyman or the Senator before we conclude?
Hey, John, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Just thanks for everyone participating. Apologize for Senator Nielsen not being able to be on with budget still going on in the Senate. He just wasn't able to make it, but thought this was well run for the realities that we're having to live under here in the remote working. So just would look to August to get that date out to everyone here as quick as possible for what I assume will be kind of the closeout meeting. So, but thank you for everyone's attention today.
No, thank you, Rob. All right. Well, hey, thank you all very much.
One other thing, the upcoming Citizens Advisory Group.
Yes.
I've been able to find that information on the DWR website and upcoming notifications for those of us who are not getting the direct emails, who are not part of the 13-member committee. So, Liz, if you could take a note and put out or incorporate that into the website, not just the upcoming dates and the agendas, but the minutes that were taken to help the rest of the community.
Matt, I just forwarded it to you. So, and I just forwarded you some of that, Matt, directly to your email.
Great.
This is Rob.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. For the group, it's you'll reach out. We can get you the address. It's on the Natural Resource Agency website. And so if there's any trouble finding that, we can circulate that with the group.
Thank you. I was looking under the wrong agency.
Understood. All right. Thank you all very much. Y'all have a good weekend, and we'll look forward to talking further sometime after August.